A little more than a century ago, the remains of a strange city were uncovered in the deep forests of Cambodia. It is said to be haunted by the spirits of those who once lived here. Join us as we explore the secrets of Angkor Wat.
Before we unlock the future, we must find the keys to the past. I'm Leonard Nimoy. Join me and open the door to ancient mysteries beginning now.
The jungles of Cambodia have resonated to the fury of war for centuries. But no conflict was more ravaging than the dreaded killing fields of recent times, which took the lives of millions. One in 7 of the population perished. Mingling the spirits of Cambodia's present with spirits from its past. Yet the people endure, their faith reinforced by the reminder of a once proud history. These are the remains of Angkor, Cambodia's ancient capital. For the past 20 years, they were isolated from the outside world, encircled by landmines and booby traps, as ensuing regimes claimed the site as their own. Now, as a frail peace returns, they are accessible once more. Angkor, one of the great archaeological treasures of the world. 75 square miles of shrines, stone palaces, towers, and temples, covering an area twice the size of Manhattan. Upon their discovery nearly 150 years ago, archaeologists gazed upon them in amazement, calling them grander than anything left by Greece or Rome. But who created these abandoned temples? And how did the inhabitants once live in this place of splendid isolation? Now, as Buddhist monks come to commune with the lost spirits of Cambodia's past, journey back in time to mingle with ghosts, warriors, and kings as we unlock the ancient mysteries of Angkor Wat. Today in northwestern Cambodia, at the restored temple called Angkor Wat, contemporary dancers evoke the spirits of the past. The ritual dance recalls the legends of a time when this was the capital of the powerful Khmer Empire 1,000 years ago. It is a celebration of early Khmer kings who built spired temples here to please the gods and to glorify themselves. The most renowned of the many religious buildings at Angkor was built by a king known as Suryavarman II. He came to power in the year 1113, expanding the realm of the Khmer Empire throughout Southeast Asia. Angkor Wat was his crowning accomplishment. His funerary temple serving a similar purpose to the pyramid tombs of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Workers are believed to have labored on the building for almost 40 years. Angkor Wat is the most famous of Angkor's more than 200 existing separate structures. Though built in the 12th century, it was mysteriously abandoned in the 15th. It is considered an architectural wonder, one of the world's largest stone monuments. The highest of its 5 towers looms almost 700 feet into the sky. It is also the largest religious building in the world, dwarfing most of the great cathedrals of Europe. But why was this incredible city's creation and its later abandonment unknown for so long to the outside world?
The West didn't hear anything about this magnificent kingdom that was built in the heartland of a jungle on a floodplain with fabulous monuments. The West knew nothing about this until the middle of the 19th century. So we have nearly 400 years where nothing was known about this superb civilization. I think this is where the mystery of Angkor comes in the minds of the Westerners.
The mystery of Angkor was introduced to the West by a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot. In 1860, while exploring northwestern Cambodia, he was led here by an old rice farmer who told him of a fabulous city set deep in the jungle where the angry gods had hidden it from man. After a long, difficult journey, cutting through miles of untamed jungle, there they were. Mouhot was spellbound by his discovery. For 400 years, concealed by the unrelenting forest, here lay the deserted ruins of great stone temples.
To obtain any idea of the splendor of these ruins, one must imagine the most beautiful creations of architecture transported into the depths of the forest in one of the most remote parts of the world. One must ask, what has become of this powerful race, so civilized and enlightened to create these gigantic works? Oh, sad fragility of human things. Henri Mouhot, 1868.
For 3 weeks, day and night, Mouhot explored the ruins. He kept a diary which was published, accompanied by engravings of his drawings.
The temple is a rival to that of Solomon's. It was created by some ancient Michelangelo. I have written these notes by the light of a torch. My desire is not to impose my opinions on anyone, but simply to disclose the existence of these monuments, which are certainly more gigantic and, to my mind, display more perfect taste than any left to us by Egypt, Greece, or Rome. Henri Mouhot, 1868.
Before he was able to return to Europe, Mouhot died of a fever. He was 35 years old. Though many others would explore Angkor, scholars credit Mouhot more than any other for lifting the veil on this once secluded and forgotten world in the Southeast Asian jungle.
There were several missionaries and traders who visited Angkor and recorded it in the 15th and 16th century. The French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese. We have records of all of them. But Mouhot, what he was able to do, that none of the others were, is that he was able to bring Angkor to the attention of the West, Europe, and specifically England, and to generate an interest in this fabulous site, this magnificent kingdom that was created in the middle of the jungle.
It was left to archaeologists like American Russell Sheehan to solve the mystery of who built Angkor's magnificent temples.
We know very little about the way the ancient Khmer lived. We know very little about the material culture that they had. We know nothing about their scientific instruments. We know nothing about their tools, their basic implements. We know very little about their the way they educated the people or the way they dealt with their society. And of course, many of these answers, the material culture answers, can be solved through excavations. And almost no below-ground excavation has been done at this site.
Eventually, Angkor would yield some of its secrets about those who once lived here. 2 miles to the northwest of Angkor Wat is the ancient capital of the Khmer Empire. It is known as Angkor Thom, second largest of the many religious sites here. At an elaborate temple called the Bayon, silent stones speak loudly of the life that once coursed through this vast complex of shrines, palaces, and places of worship. 1 million people made their homes here by the 13th century. Their lives reflect a surprising array of very familiar and very human activities. Triumphs in battle and war, often against invaders from neighboring Thailand and Vietnam. The grand procession of the king on his return to the capital. On the outer galleries of the Bayon, a visual litany of daily life 700 years ago. Preparing a meal. Butchering an animal. Setting a table. A board game. Preparing for a hunt. A cruel yet popular sport, a cockfight. Timeless moments, forever frozen in silence and in stone. After archaeologists began to explore the site, other clues to the past began to emerge from study of the Sanskrit and ancient Khmer inscriptions that adorn Angkor's monuments. It was learned that Angkor Wat, one of the earliest complexes to be built, was financed by the spoils of war. It was constructed by artisans, laborers, and slaves captured in battle. Huge stones were transported in 3,000 ox carts to the site, where elephants took over. Blocks of stone were slid back and forth, grinding their surfaces until, without mortar, they would fit perfectly in place.
When you cross the bridge to Angkor Wat, it's almost like you're walking through space. You have the sky beneath you reflected in the water and the sky above. It creates this feeling of a special journey and a journey that will separate you from the world that you've left behind. Then when you're inside the corridors and walking along and seeing the reliefs, the history of the king and the gods, there's a sense of the 12th century that starts to come through. So in a way you have walked out of your time period as you go through the corridors and into the 12th century.
When the first of Angkor Wat's towers rose above the jungles of Cambodia, the world was echoing to the sounds of construction elsewhere. In Italy, the Basilica of St. Mark's was being completed in Venice. In England, Westminster Abbey had risen in central London. And in France, Notre Dame Cathedral was soon to dominate the skyline of Paris. For many years, few Europeans believed that native Cambodians possessed the skills to build a temple like Angkor Wat. They were wrong. Angkor was built entirely by indigenous people. Still a sacred religious site revered by Buddhists, it stands as proud testimony to a spiritual and social commitment made by the Cambodian people almost 1,000 years ago. Yet many mysteries prevail. Because of years of war and political instability, very little excavation has been done on the site. Two miles from the Angkor Wat Temple is the ancient Khmer capital called Angkor Thom. To enter the city meant crossing one of the 5 massive bridges guarded by rows of enormous stone giants. The city was built by King Yayavarman VII, who in 1181 became the last great Khmer ruler. In his 40-year reign, he would become Angkor's most prolific builder. The place had suffered years of ruinous wars with its neighbors, until Yayavarman came to power by conquering the enemy. The wars had devastated the city of Angkor, and its population had been driven off. Yayavarman's daunting task was to rebuild the city. But first, he had to impose his will and authority on 1 million scattered, war-weary people and move them to embark on this incredible task.
He imposed his personal authority over the landscape and over the people with an amazing demonstration of power that is hard to understand in the 20th century. It's hard to understand why people could be lured back out of the forests to work to build this new city.
At the center of the city stands the king's supreme creation, the Bayon Temple. A labyrinthine structure of corridors and courtyards, sitting on a raised stone terrace, it is Angkor's last great monument. Each of its 54 towers is carved with 4 gigantic faces, gazing out in all 4 directions. 200 faces keep constant vigil, watching north, south, east, and west for anyone who might threaten the city. Visitors were overwhelmed, sometimes shaken by the sight.
The visitor is impressed by an evil sensation. All those staring eyes, my blood curdled. I was being observed from all sides. Pierre Loti, the Angkor Pilgrim, 1912.
Carvings were once thought to represent the Hindu god Brahma, but some have suggested the faces are that of the king himself, watching over his people. There are inscriptions carved into the walls of the Bayon Temple that comment on the king's feelings for his people.
He felt the afflictions of his subjects more than his own, because the suffering of the people constitute the suffering of the king more than his own suffering. Inscription on Bayon wall.
The Cambodians worship their king as though he were divine. And in fact, the inscriptions tell us that a part of divinity was inside the king, and a part of the king was inside the god. It was interchangeable. So when he went to worship in the central temple, That statue was not just a statue of the god. That statue contained an element of the king himself.
Command performances by the king's concubines could be observed from the top of the steps that led to the king's secret quarters within the compound of the royal palace. But for the king, the sublime bliss and serenity of palace life was dominated by legends that predicted the fall of his empire.
According to legend, every night the king had to ascend these steps, and at the top of the steps was a 9-headed serpent princess, and she was disguised as a woman, and every night it was necessary for him to have sexual intercourse with this princess. If he failed to do this, not only would he die, but the hereditary lineage of the Khmer civilization would dissolve.
In the Bayon Temple, there's a sculpture representing the life-sustaining generative organ of the kingdom. It is an erect phallus made of polished stone called a lingam. It is an ancient Hindu symbol representing the force with which the king bestowed new fertility and crops upon his kingdom. Though admired as a work of art, it is also an object of worship. In the is a strange shaft with a sculpted alcove. It describes the story of a sacred snake that was believed to have lived in the shaft when the temple was being built. Yayavarman ordered a drain installed, connecting the shaft to a hole in the temple wall so that the snake could look out and watch the construction. According to legend, when the snake saw the enormous faces being carved in the towers, it became so frightened it fled the temple grounds, taking with it its sacred spirit. The king became furious. He pursued the snake and killed it. Then he became sick with remorse. But a sage said he could not be forgiven for killing the snake and cursed the king. He prophesied that Angkor would be abandoned, doomed to become a kingdom inhabited only by monkeys. 200 years later, in the 15th century, Thailand invaded Cambodia again, and the curse would come true. Angkor was in its heyday during the reign of Yayavarman VII, 800 years ago. Much of the city's lifestyle would have been lost to history were it not for the visit of a Chinese envoy by the name of Chao Taquan. He was dispatched to Angkor to collect tribute from the king, and was so intrigued by what he saw that he stayed for a year.
Chao Taquan has left us with an extremely important record. It is the only first-hand account of Angkor that is left today. This possibly helps to clarify some of the mysteries, but it also explains why there are so many mysteries about Angkor, because we have absolutely no literary evidence from Angkor whatsoever. We have inscriptions on the temple walls, but we have no literature from that time period, except this first-hand account by Chao Taquan, which is extremely important. And he witnessed the daily life of the Khmers at the capital.
Historians today still rely upon the 13th century observations of Chao Taquan.
Both men and women go bare-breasted and perfume themselves with sandalwood and musk. The king has 5 wives, and as for concubines and palace girls, I have heard it said they number from 3,000 to 5,000. Everyone with whom I talked said that Cambodian women are highly sexed, but although their sexual impulses were very strong, it is said some of them remain faithful. Chao Taquan, 1297.
Chao Taquan was allowed to witness the everyday ritual duties of the king.
The king gives 2 audiences a day for the disposition of affairs of state. Dignitaries and common people who wish to see the sovereign wait until he appears in a golden window holding the sacred sword in his hand. It is plain to see that these people, though barbarians, know what is due a prince. Chao Taquan.
Chao Taquan even offers travel advice to his fellow countrymen.
Chinese coming to this country note with pleasure that it is not necessary to wear clothes, and since rice is easily had, women easily persuaded, houses easily run, and trade easily carried on, a great many take up permanent residence. Worship of the Buddha is universal. Chao Taquan.
Though originally Hindu, it is a mystery why Angkor eventually embraced the Buddhist religion. But by the 12th century, Jayavarman himself had converted to Buddhism, thus becoming Angkor's first Buddhist king. He felt his most important task was to fulfill the spiritual destiny of his people.
Jayavarman VII saw himself as the savior, I think, of the Cambodian people, as a sort of, if you like, a super priest. He saw himself indeed as an embodiment of the Buddha, liberating and enlightening Cambodian people from their previous ignorance and darkness, which was associated in his mind, I think, with Hinduism.
Buddhism still enfolds the lives of the people who live close to Angkor in the nearby town of Siem Reap. Though the 20th century predominates, the Cambodians are indelibly linked to their ancestors. Yet an unanswered question lingers. Why did the ancient Khmer people suddenly forsake their home in the jungle? The towers of Angkor Wat symbolize the peaks of Mount Meru, the Olympus of the Hindu gods, center of the universe. The building is imbued with many unique qualities and is precisely aligned with the annual solar and lunar cycles. Here, ancient astronomers observed the movement of the sun, moon, and stars. Angkor Wat is so aligned that on the summer solstice, June 21st, the longest day of the year, the sun may be observed rising directly behind the central tower. As the sun shifts its course, its rays gradually illuminate the many galleries that pictorially tell the story of Cambodia's past.
We wandered in astonishment through labyrinths of courts, cloisters, and chambers, encountering at every turn some new marvel, unheard of, undreamed of, until then. The English governess at the Siamese court, Anna Leon Owens, 1870.
Anna Leon Owens was governess to the children of the King of Siam. After reading the diaries of Henri Mouhot, she traveled almost 200 miles by elephant to view for herself the wonders of Angkor Wat. She is the woman whose experiences would be portrayed in the musical The King and I.
Every wall and pillar is decorated with carvings so that the whole temple seems hung with petrified tapestry, surpassing the best works of the modern world. Anna Leon Owens.
Is there a special message to be conveyed by these carvings? For some, these images invoke not only the power, but the joy of the Khmer gods.
As one walks into the temples of Angkor, you often see celestial maidens standing near doorways, flying over figures, dancing on pillars. These maidens welcome the visitor to one of the highest realms of the gods. As you walk in, they only exist in a god realm. They don't exist in the human realm. So it indicates to you as you walk into a temple that you've left your human realm behind and you're now in the realm of the gods.
The celestial nymphs, called the Apsaras, line the interior walls of Angkor Wat. They are among the most extraordinary examples of Cambodian art.
You walk into a large courtyard, and around the walls are an estimated 1,500 of these female divinities. They're extraordinary in their beauty, but when you walk into the courtyard, you sort of think, well, there are lots of females on the wall, but as you move closer, you realize that every single female is different. There's a difference in her dress, in her hair, in her jewelry, in what she's holding, and it's quite an unusual experience.
The murals are the most spectacular feature of Angkor Wat. Historic battles between Cambodia and Thailand are depicted as ancient armies meet in ferocious combat. As local legend has it, the art of Angkor may hold the key to the secret of immortality. A famous bas-relief depicts a Hindu myth about gods and demons who have been churning an ocean of milk for 1,000 years in order to produce an elixir that will provide eternal life. To create the elixir, a row of gods on one side and a row of demons on the other pulled the body of a serpent god in one direction and then in the other. Eventually, it is believed that the churning will yield the elusive elixir of immortality. Many still come to worship at Angkor. An enduring mystery is an ancient echo chamber. Why was it built? What was its purpose? Some believe it was designed to invoke the resident spirits. It is utilized not only by monks and priests in meditation, but also by ordinary Cambodians who, with a little help, hope to capture a sense of their ancestral past.
The deepest Khmer religious beliefs, as far as we can tell, are the ones that are still very deeply entrenched in Cambodia today. And these are beliefs in the power of ancestral spirits. And these wouldn't be ancestral spirits the way we might think of our genealogy, of people whom we're actually descended from, but rather the spirits of people who died in a particular place and were either cremated or buried in that place. And these are spirits of a place rather than of a particular family.
Monks who are frequently drawn to Angkor sometimes tell tales of experiencing spiritual visitations here. Recently, at a temple called the Phimianakis, one monk claimed to have an especially lifelike vision of ghosts.
He told me that at night, every once in a while, he could see princesses and princes, members of ancient royal families, their ghosts, walking up and down the corridors And I looked at him and I thought, oh, you know, that sounds very interesting, but I don't think I want to be here at night to see it myself. He was very convincing, and he told me that as a confidence. You know, he meant it to be a special kind of gift to me because I had become a friend. He also told me that the royal family in times of trouble would take their jewels and their treasures and throw them into the ponds around the Pimienicas. And he said there were lots of buried treasure at Angkor. People still believe that.
For hundreds of years, Cambodians believed that deep beneath the Angkor Wat temple complex, a secret repository held an untold fortune of sacred treasure. Here, an enormous statue of the Hindu god Vishnu once stood, covering Angkor Wat's 89-foot deep central shaft. In the 1930s, George Trouvé was a curator who investigated the central shaft of Angkor Wat. For 8 months, his team dug into the shaft, trying to reach the sacred treasure that was believed to be buried at its base. But because of rain, the shaft kept filling with water. Finally, workers were able to pump out all the excess water. One evening, as his team continued their exploration, Trouvé went to sleep. Just after dawn, he was awakened by his excited workers loudly calling out that they had found something. Trouvé ran to see what the commotion was all about. At the bottom of the shaft, hidden within a cavity, was a large rock. His men had found 2 gold leaves and 2 white sapphires. Were they part of the legendary treasure that was buried here when the temple was built? We may never know.
What is unusual about all of this and very tragic is not many months after that, George Trouvé died. And he was the most promising of all the conservators. And though the French don't talk about it, it sounds like he killed himself. And I always felt he should not have pulled up the sacred treasure of Angkor Wat. It should have been kept buried. It was a mistake.
The precious stones were lost, and there has been no trace of them since. Could sacred treasure still be buried here? Future excavations may provide the answer. After years of invasions and counter-invasions, in 1461, Thailand invaded and sacked Angkor for the last time. Once in Angkor, there had been wooden and stone buildings stretching as far as the eye could see. Now, gradually, the great stone monuments would disappear into the encroaching forest, and the wooden structures would be turned into dust. Why was Angkor abandoned? Several theories abound. Some say the Cambodian merchant elite found trading opportunities more lucrative elsewhere. Others believe the outbreak of a deadly disease may have killed off much of the population. Disruption of the water supply was perhaps the most likely reason for abandonment. But one thing is certain, there was a very sudden and rapid depletion of the population.
We know from other records that the traditional warfare in Southeast Asia involved the carrying off of the populations of the cities that were attacked. These populations were taken off as to form new communities in the victorious country. They were taken off rather basically to grow rice for the victors in the new place. They're pulled out of Angkor. Certainly, and of course, lots of soldiers were killed in these battles. Lots of men were killed, and lots of men, women, and children were carried off.
It was 1860 when French explorer Henri Mouhot first stumbled into the city of Angkor. Within 3 years, the French had established their colonial rule in Cambodia. Ever since, archaeologists have worked sporadically at Angkor, clearing away the undergrowth, repairing and restoring statues, dismantling and then reassembling the monuments. In so doing, much of Angkor's spectacular heritage has been reclaimed. But the archaeologists have merely skimmed the surface of the many mysteries that still lie buried here.
The biggest mystery of Angkor is that all of the work has been done above ground on restorations of the monuments. There has been no below ground excavation, so we know nothing about the material culture of these people. If we compare the ancient Khmer with the Maya in Mesoamerica, or the Egyptians in Egypt, we know much more about the material cultures of those areas. If we were to undertake excavations here, we would increase our wealth of knowledge tenfold in a very short time.
Over the years, a serious problem has been the looting and mutilation of Angkor's sculptures and statues. Tragically, thousands of statues have been decapitated. Of the countless religious statues that have stood here over the centuries, only a fraction remain.
The monuments of Angkor are under great pressure from international art thieves. We find the monuments being desecrated, heads being cut off, bas-relief being stolen, and taken out of the country, being sold on the international black market. If a similar sort of theft was occurring in Europe, it would create a huge international incident. Yet here, it's only the Cambodian people trying to prevent their culture from being stolen.
After being sacked in the 15th century, Cambodia's capital was moved from Angkor to its present site, the city of Phnom Penh. It is from here that the government coordinates attempts to stop artifacts from illegally leaving the country. But only a concerted international effort will stem the flow. Meanwhile, in the jungle, Angkor slumbers. "800 years ago, this was King Yayavarman VII's private sanctuary, his own sacred altar. It is said that for Cambodian worshippers today, the chamber radiates a powerful spiritual presence that seems to emanate from a sense of ancient rituals, meditations, and consecrations which for so many years have taken place here." Not far away, at the memorial to the killing fields, is remembrance of another sort. A place of lamentation and prayer for victims of 1,000 years of ongoing wars, including the innocent million who fell in the killing fields of recent history. In Angkor today, the spirits of the past and the present have become one.